Hello, in this tutorial we're going to add the sound that will play when a missile is fired and also when a missile collides with an enemy ship. Now the first step to do that is going to be to bring the explosion wave and missile shot wave files into our assets folder. So go ahead and copy those into your Star Shooter assets folder, and then over here in the assets folder of the project itself we're going to add files. We're going to pick the explosion wave and the missile shot wave and add those in. So now we have those two files as assets. Very similar to playing the background music, we're going to play these, but the difference is going to be that we're going to play these only when certain events occur. We're still going to need players for these sounds though. So I'm going to create a private static, and the difference here is that it's going to be a sound player, and we still get the sound player because we're using that audio SDK. So I'm going to create a missile SP, meaning the missile SP is a sound player object, and I'm also going to create a static sound player for the explosion, so that whenever an explosion occurs, we're going to play whatever sound is associated with this sound player. So I've got a missile SP and an explosion SP that I'll use as the sound players. Down here in Initialize, I'm going to do something very, very similar to my background music player, in that I'm going to set up these sound players and get them ready to play whenever these events occur. And I do that quite easily just by creating a new sound, and I'll call this the missile sound. And then missile sound is going to be equal to a new sound, missile sound is equal to a new sound. I've got a typo here, so I don't want a sound status, I want a sound for my missile sound, and missile sound is equal to a new sound, and I'm going to point that to the application assets missile shot dot WAV. So this is the wave file called missile_shot that we brought into our assets folder, and I'm going to create a new sound called missile sound based on that, and then I'm going to set my missile SP, which is my sound player for the missile, to be equal to the missile sound dot create player. So you should see that it's very similar to creating that background music player. I'm going to first load a background music, and then I'm going to set the background music player to be a player based upon that background music. Here with the missile sound, I've created a sound object called missile sound, and then the missile sound is equal to a new sound loaded from that WAV file, and then I'm going to create the missile sound player, which we declared as a variable inside of my class based upon that missile sound. Okay, the next thing I can do is create a sound for the explosion. I'll call it explosion sound, and the explosion sound is going to be equal to a new sound, and I'm going to pull that explosion wave file from my application assets explosion WAV. So now I've got this explosion sound, and then I'll set the explosion SP to be equal to the explosion sound, and let's create a player based on that. Okay, so now I have my missile SP and my explosion SP, and both of these are different sound players bound to different sounds. The missile SP is bound to that missile shot wave file, and the explosion SP is bound to that explosion wave file. And now that I have my variables all set up, let's actually play the sounds at the right time. So notice here when I create a missile and I add that missile in, that's where I'd actually like to play the sound. So I just say missile SP, which is my missile sound player, and I'll just tell it to play. And whatever wave file is associated with that sound player is going to play. So whenever I create a new missile and add it into the screen, I'm going to play this missile sound. And then later on, when we handle the collision, if we actually have an explosion that goes on because the missile and the enemy collide, I'd like to actually play that explosion sound. So here on the check for collisions, if I have a collision and there's that overlap between the rectangles, I'm going to say the explosion sound player, and I'll tell it to play. Okay, so now we've added the wave files into our project. We've created these sound players for the explosion and the missile launch. And then when we have a collision, we'll play the explosion SP. And whenever we create a new missile, we'll play the sound associated with that missile SP. So let's run this now and see what we get. I've got a slight error here. Looks like I've got a typo. So let's stop this. It turns out that it's not a typo, it's because my assets that I brought in are not being compiled. So there's a good example of the error that we get if we run this. Let's show this again. All right, so it's giving us the fact that the IO file not found exception occurred. So let's drill down into that and see what's going on. It's giving me an error right here at line 83 where it's trying to load that missile shot. So if you get an error like this, it could be that you have a typo, that you're misspelling something and it's not finding the file. But in our case, the explosion wave and the missile shot wave, if we look at the properties of those, you'll see that the build action is marked as none. And so we need to mark those as content because they're not being compiled in and added as content into our project. And the same thing is true with the explosion wave. So let's add that as content. Remember, the graphics are automatically marked as content, but the audio, the background sound that we did, we needed to mark that as content. We need to do the same thing here with the explosion wave and the missile shot wave. Okay, so if we run this now, it should find them, no problem. And we're running, and I can take a shot. And here we get an audio when it launches. And we get an audio when the explosion occurs. Okay, so now we have event-driven audio, where whenever I launch a missile and whenever the missile collides with an enemy ship, it's going to play the appropriate explosion and missile shot audio there. So as a reminder of what we did, we brought in the explosion wave and the missile shot wave. Don't forget to mark those as build action content to make sure that they are being brought into the final solution there. And then we created the sound players for missile SP and explosion SP. We set those up here in the initialize, where we're loading the missile shot wave and binding that to a sound, and the explosion wave and binding that to the sound, and then creating sound players based upon those. And then whenever we have a shot being fired, we'll tell that missile sound player to play that audio, and whenever we have a collision, we'll tell that explosion sound player to play audio. Now you might have noticed that the volume on those was pretty loud. So one of the things we could do to adjust that is to set the explosion sound player, or the volume, to be less than 1. So we could set that to be 0.5, for example. And here, before we play the missile SP, we could set the volume of that to be, let's say, 0.25. And now if we, let's convert those to floating point values. So instead of 0.25, just put 0.25F. And here we can do the same thing here. And now when we fire, that volume isn't nearly as overwhelming. So you could adjust those accordingly to be whatever you think is best. Now we have one more improvement that we need to make, and that is we're not actually showing the explosion occur, we're just removing the missiles and making them disappear. So in the next tutorial we'll fix that up and have the actual explosion show on the screen.